Recollections of a troopship at Southampton during Operation Overlord. Off Lepe Beach awaiting orders. One by one the 8 other ships of the convoy slipped quietly away, bearing their complement of fighting men across the channel for the assault on Europe. Only New Australia failed to leave. We had no orders to sail, and next morning we were banished to an anchorage in the Solent off Lepe, where we could see the naval signal station at the Cowes Yacht Club on the Isle of Wight, but were otherwise out of sight and apparently out of mind. It was reminiscent of the assault on Sicily, when we had languished off Suez, but this time we had a shipload of troops aboard. We had come round from the Thames on D-Day +1, and as each day passed the senior officer commanding the troops became more and more restive. But still we received no orders. As D-Day +5 dawned it was decided that something just had to be done. The ship's motor lifeboat was lowered, and an army officer of senior rank was conveyed to Southampton. Having dropped the officer at the town quay, the ship's boat had a long wait for his return. The officer commandeered a taxi to take him to the command headquarters at Southwick, where it took him some time to convince the high command that a ship full of troops, with a key role in the assault on Europe, was lying idle and forgotten in the Solent. Things at last began to hum, and we received orders to return to Spithead as soon as we had recovered the messenger. It took him several hours to get back to the ship. As the boat at last hove into sight, the troops aboard gave him a hearty cheer. D-Day +6. We weighed anchor and returned to Spithead, where we at last received our sailing orders. These were of the utmost importance, as we had to follow a swept channel to the beachhead, the English Channel and the seas around the British Isles being awash with mines. We had followed a swept channel down the east coast and from the Thames estuary. These channels were swept regularly, and woe betide us were we to stray into a minefield. We left in the last of the daylight, fetching up off Gold Beach early in the morning of D-Day +6, 4 days late, and dropped anchor within a mile of the shore. Landing craft infantry's LCIs came alongside our port side forward. The troops clambered over the rail and down scrambling nets into the waiting landing craft, which would then run them to the beach, returning when empty for another load. 3 LCIs could maintain a continuous flow of troops from ship to shore, and in 2 hours or so all our troops were off the ship, and we were able to retrace our course for home. It was noisy, with warships firing heavy guns, aircraft flying overhead, and guns firing ashore. There were ships and landing craft of all shapes and sizes, block ships sunk to act as breakwaters, and the huge caissoons of the Mulberry Harbour moored in position. Wreckage ashore and in the shallows provided poignant evidence of the casualties of the assault. Nevertheless there was order in the confusion, and our mastery of the beachhead was evident in that we were unmolested. Had we arrived on D-Day +2 as intended, it would no doubt have been very much noisier and more chaotic. Tied up at Southampton Docks, Queen's Park. We tied up alongside in Southampton Docks, and before taking another shipload of troops across, a certain amount of paperwork concerning our crew had to be gone through. An organization had been set up in a Nissan hut in Queen's Park just outside the docks. This was the Combined Operations Merchant Navy Organization (COMNO). One of its leading lights was John Dinnis No. 2 off the Dilwara, who had also been recalled from leave. We were all issued with special passes, and were required to sign to the effect that we would go wherever required, notwithstanding the fact that we had already signed the ship's articles to that effect. We had the option to refuse, if I remember correctly, but as we had all been over the other side already and found it harmless enough, there was not one of us, either Indian or European, anxious to exercise this option. We were not long in port before embarking our next lot of British troops, this time including a few WIC's Women's Royal Army Corps, who were nimble enough to negotiate the ship's rail and the scrambling nets for the disembarkation off the beaches. American troops. When we eventually returned to Southampton for our next embarkation, it was for American troops. We made 14 crossings to Normandy all told, only the first 2 with British troops, all the other 12 with American troops. The American beaches were to the west of the British beaches, and we disembarked the GIs at Omaha Beach. All told we carried 27,055 troops across to France, perhaps a dozen women included in this figure. Our route to the British beaches, if my memory does not play me false, was via Spithead and the east coast of the Isle of Wight, whereas that to the American beaches was through the Solent and to the west of the island. The tide would sometimes run swiftly through the narrows between Hurst Castle and the Isle of Wight at the Solent's western outlet, and I recall returning empty through this passage on one occasion with the tide against us and, despite our 12 or 13 knot speed, we seemed to pass Hurst Castle at a snail's pace. Perhaps it was a one-way street, out by Spithead, home by the Solent. However, I rather think that when carrying American troops we always took the western route. We never had a tough trip across with the American troops, as by this time the Allied command of sea and air was well nigh absolute. Queen Victoria Hospital, Netley. It was unusual to find ourselves alongside in Southampton for any length of time. If not immediately required, we would anchor out of the way in the Solent on 12 hours' notice, sometimes longer than that. So we rarely went ashore in Southampton. Southampton had always been a prime target for the German bombers, and not only had the docks suffered severe damage earlier in the war, but so had the town itself. The High Street and above bar had hardly a building undamaged, two of the few to escape being the Bargate northern entrance to the old medieval town, and St. Michael's Church. There was not a surfeit of entertainment for sailors home from the sea there in any case. When wanted, the ship would be summoned into a berth in the old docks, where we would take on a few stores and top up the water tanks while embarking our next body of troops. Bunkering would take several days, and Southampton had a stock of coal. To receive it we secured to buoys off Netley Pier, moored fore and aft. I only recall bunkering once, but as our range was at least 3,000 miles I dare say that this was all that was needed. The British workman did not work coal with quite the enthusiasm of his eastern counterpart, so that it took longer here than it did in the far-flung outposts of the Empire. The coal would arrive by lighter towed by a tug. It was of course no less dusty, and the whole ship would get filthy as usual, but we were able to use the ship's boat to ferry ourselves to the nearby pier. The wounded from France had come this way in the 1914-18 war. The hospital itself is one of the longest buildings in the country. There was a roadway in the hospital grounds along the shore. Straight ahead the wounded would have been taken from the pier directly to the main entrance of the hospital with its imposing tower above. However, we would turn left along the roadway as we left the pier, and it was a long walk past the north wing of the hospital to the large iron gateway, which was the entrance to the hospital grounds. Here we were in the village of Netley. We could take a bus into Southampton from here if we were prepared to wait long enough, but Netley was undamaged by the bombing and we were able to enjoy the hospitality of its pubs. The duty boat to Cowes. While at anchor in the Solent, the Navy supplied a duty boat, which made the rounds of the ships congregated there to collect anyone wishing to go ashore in Cowes, and there were regular trips from Cowes to bring us back again. Cowes too was undamaged. The little holiday town, normally catering for the yachting fraternity, now largely absent, had a wealth of shops, eating houses and public houses. This was a facility we much appreciated, while the hard-pressed traders ashore must surely also have benefited from our custom. We were quite often able to take advantage of this facility and got to know the little town quite well. One Sunday morning the Irish doctor and I decided to go ashore there. The pubs would not be open until later, but he knew of one where the Irish landlady would admit a fellow countryman. Looking around carefully to make sure that no policeman was in sight, we sneaked round to the back door. The doc gave a secret knock on the door, which was then opened a crack. Once satisfied, the landlady greeted him with her usual Irish charm and let us in. We were not the first customers, however. There in solitary state was Paddy, the assistant troop cook, who must have caught an earlier Liberty boat. Mindful of his promise to get me, I hastily stood the first round. He accepted my offer gladly, and as there were now 2 other witnesses present, he considered the moment inopportune and the 3 of us had an enjoyable morning. Missed the boat. On another occasion when the ship was not expected to sail, 2 of us took the bus to Newport one afternoon. When we eventually made our way back to Cowes for the Liberty boat to take us back aboard, there was no ship to be seen. New Aurelia had vanished. We reported to the Navy at the Yacht Club, where we learned that the ship had been recalled to Southampton to embark troops the following morning. The last ferry for Southampton had left by then, and there was no means of rejoining the ship before the first ferry the next day. We had just enough money left between us for the fare, but not enough to pay for a bed as well. The Navy generously offered us the carpeted floor of the yacht club, which we had little option but to accept. We slept brokenly on the hard floor in our best uniforms, rousing ourselves stiffly as the sun rose next morning. We managed to catch the first ferry, hungry and unshaven. By the time we actually boarded the ship, embarkation had already started. At least I had done better than had Miles in Balboa. The ship had been recalled at short notice, and although several stalwarts had been dispatched to comb the pubs in Cowes and Newport, they had failed to find us. Sausages. Early one morning, when we were berthed near the end of the river test side of the old docks in Southampton, I was disturbed by the sound of a Beaufort gun firing. It was one of our own guns, and it was blazing away at a doodlebug puttering past on its deadly mission to cause havoc somewhere in the neighborhood. It had come over from France or the Low Countries, so it was dead on target, but I never discovered just where it came down. This was the only time to my knowledge that we ever fired our defensive armament in anger, and sadly our defensively equipped merchant ship gunners missed the target. It was not, of course, an easy one. I reflected on the years of monotonous standby they had endured. The other side of the coin, however, was that by great good fortune in all that time, save for the night raid on the convoy after leaving Iran, Euralia had never been attacked whilst I had been aboard her. I was lounging over the forward rail on the promenade deck as American troops were coming aboard one afternoon, when a GI accosted me, "Say, can you direct me to the PX?" Direct is two stressed syllables in their language, while the PX, in case you may be unacquainted with such matters, is what we would call the canteen, where various goods are on sale. We would write it PX, but the Yanks don't pronounce it that way. I replied, "Sure bud, just along fatter ways." He was so impressed with my American accent that he inquired, "Say, what part the States you come from?" I was highly flattered at the compliment, but disabused him of his error, and pointed out that I was proud to be an Englishman. As we had discovered in the Mediterranean, the American troops did not exactly enthuse over the good old English food we gave them, having a distinct aversion to our sausages. They were not short of money, of course, and we had to keep the canteen well stocked. If they failed to find what they were looking for in the canteen, they would broach their K rations, which were intended to keep them going on the other side until they made contact with a field kitchen. Our sausages tended to get short shrift. While our country folk at home were quietly starving, we were consigning vast quantities of the best pork sausages to the deep on our homeward runs. Representations were made to the sea transport authorities to permit us not to have to feed the American troops, particularly with sausages, or at least to reduce the ration, but it was all to no avail. I still weep tears at the thought of all those beautiful sausages being consigned, trip after trip, to the English Channel.